This is the Ryzen 7900X, the 12-core CPU, and for creators, this might be the most appealing option for you, just because it gets you most of the way there, is much better than the 7700X, and doesn't quite bear the price point of the 7950X, but performs very, very close to it. So the question is it worth considering over the Intel counterparts, and how good is it then, and is it worth the money? And I've got some very surprising results regarding power consumption that you definitely want to check out.
Looking for a cheap way to license your Windows? Check out WhoKeys through the links in the video description. Make sure to use the code TN20 to get a 30% off. Paste the license to the activation settings and you're all done. This license is for Windows 10, but you can upgrade it to Windows 11 for free. They also offer Microsoft Office 19 license. Use the same code TN20 to get a 30% off. Check out WhoKeys.com in the video description below.
So first of all, I want to talk about the price of this CPU, because this is not cheap. This CPU costs $549 at the point of making this video, and I highly recommend you go check out the latest pricing as well as some of the other CPUs that I'm comparing in the video description below, because then you get the most accurate representation. And here I want to give huge shout out to CCL Computers, who provide me with this CPU as well as the rest of the Ryzen 7000 CPUs to actually give you this content and review them. So if you're in the UK, highly recommend go check out CCL and their computers as well as all the PC parts that they're offering there, just because I found that they are often the cheapest place to buy these PC parts as well as PCs and laptops. There's loads of stuff. Go check them out. Huge thanks to CCL. Thanks guys. Links for them in the description below. But if you're looking at the competition of this Ryzen 9, then the main competitor is the 12700K from previous generation. And by the time this CPU was launched, the 13700K wasn't actually launched. But because now it is, I'm gonna add this into the mix here as well. 13700K, 12700K, and 5900X are the CPUs that we're going to be comparing here. The 13700K is actually quite a bit cheaper, over $100 cheaper than this one, which is quite a big price difference actually. The 12700K is even more cheaper and comes in at $377. By the way, I did see some deals on the 12700K, so definitely check out the latest pricing in the description below, especially this holiday season if you're looking to pick up that one and get a huge discount. And then we have the 5900X, which is $348. Now, we could talk about the platform difference in price, which obviously the Ryzen 5000 is the most expensive there, just because the motherboards are more expensive and so on. So the platform adoption isn't that good like at first when you look at the Ryzen 7000. The 13th gen and the 12th gen seem much better bang for buck, just if you look at, you know, motherboard, RAM, and CPU cost altogether. But then there's the other part of this Ryzen 7000, which a lot of people like and which is very, very appealing for people, which is the future-proofness of the Ryzen 7000 platform. In fact, the AM5 socket, which basically means that if AMD supports AM5 as long as the AM4, there's huge upgrade path for this Ryzen 7000 series CPUs. Most likely 4 generations to come. AMD has kind of said that it's up to 2025 support for this. We don't know exactly what it means and how many, generations of CPUs are there, but it is slightly appealing if you look at the upgrade path for your CPU. If you're looking at the specs of the CPUs we're going to be comparing in this video, then the interesting thing is that the 13700K looks like it's got more cores. At 16 cores, 24 threads, these cores aren't equal compared to the 7900X, which has 12 cores and 24 threads. So it's got 2 threads per core. So if you're looking at the thread count, the 3700K and 7900X actually share the same amount of threads. The 12700K has 4 threads less, and the 5900X has the same amount of threads as 7900X. So now we can really see the generational improvement as well as the competition from 2 different generations. Let's quickly mention the testing setup and then straight away to the benchmarks. For Ryzen 7000, I'm using Asus X67E Pro. I create a Wi-Fi for the motherboard. For Intel's 12th and 13th gen, I'm using Asus Z690 ProAd, and the Ryzen 5000 are using MSI X570S Ace Max. For RAM, the Intel and AMD for DDR5 are using the same 2 32GB of DDR5 5200 megatransfers per second Kingston Fury Beast RGB, and the Ryzen 5000 is using 2 times 32GB Kingston Fury Renegade RGB at 3600 MHz. The GPU is the same across the platform, Asus RTX 12 1390. For cooler, the Ryzen 7000 using Asus ROG Strix LC2 360mm AIO and 3 Fantex T30 fans to give it the best performance. And for Intel, we're using the Fantex Glacier 1 360mm AIO and also the 3 Fantex T30 fans on the AIO. Ryzen 5000, we're using the ROG Ryujin 360mm AIO. And all of the coolers are actually Acertech coolers. So basically, you know, the cooling performance of these coolers are exactly the same or very, very similar within the margin of error. So that doesn't make any difference. The OS SSD for Ryzen 7000 is Cardia C440 and Project SSD MSI M480 Spatnium 2TB model. For the 12th gen and 13th gen, we're using Samsung 980 Pro 1TB one for the OS drive and a 2TB 980 Pro for the project drive. The Ryzen 5000 is using Cardia C440 for the OS drive and 2TB 5Q to 530 for the project drive. In terms of power supply, the AMD systems are using Corsair HX1000 power supply and the Intel system is using Deepcool BQ1000M power supply. I quickly want to mention also memory controller, which is slightly different on the Ryzen systems than on the Intel systems. Basically, if you're using 2 sticks of DDR5, then the memory controller supports this at Gear 1 up to 5200 MTS. When you add 4 sticks, whether it's single or dual rank, then it drops down to 3600 MTS, which is quite slow. The Intel counterparts on the 13th gen support 400 MHz higher clock speeds, and the 12th gen supports 4000 MHz on 4 sticks and 4800 MHz on 2 sticks. So basically, the Ryzen 7000 CPUs aren't as impressive when you've got 4 sticks of RAM installed. For example, if you do want more than 64 GB, if you need that as a creator, then most likely you're not going to be able to run them 4000 MHz or higher. You might be able to, but it's not going to be stable. The stable speed will be 3600 MTS, which is actually quite slow compared to DDR4, so it's not that impressive really here. Whereas on Intel, we can get 400 megatransfers per second extra, which is much better. Let's look at the power consumption here, and this is 100% utilization on Cinebench R23, but that only shows how much power it's been pulled from like 100% utilization. And that's what you will see roughly in Blender applications when you're really doing some heavy rendering of 3D scenes or something like that, like Blender and V-Ray, something like that. The 7900X pulls 200 watts from the socket. The 13700K pulls 20% more and 240 watts. The 12700K looks the nicest. But if you're wanting to know the actual application average power consumption, then stick till the end of the benchmarks because that will blow your mind. Looking at Cinebench R23 first, the 13700K is 2% faster in the single core score and 6.5% faster in the multi-core score. The 12700K is 3% slower in the single core score, but 20.5% slower in the multi-core score. The 5900X is about 20% slower in the single core score, and 25% slower in the multi-core score. So in terms of the previous generation of Ryzen, we can see quite a nice leap of performance, about 20 to 25%, but compared to Intel's 13th gen, it's not so impressive. In Geekbench 5, we're seeing similar scores here, but the 12700K here now is 13% slower in the single core score and 17.9% slower in the multi-core score. That's mostly due to the 12700K having more cores, because Geekbench 5 only uses cores, not all of the threads. Moving on to Blender, and here now we can really see where this Ryzen 7000 series CPUs shine. In Blender, they're just the best at 24 threads. All of the threads are equal. They're running full speed, and here we really see them shine. So it's not the hybrid architecture that Intel are going for, and here we really see the results that even though the 13700K has more cores, it's still 1.5% slower in the monster scene, 1% slower in the junk shop scene, and 2% slower in the classroom scene. And when we're looking at the 12700K, then the 7900X really gives it a beating, 30 to 34% faster in these scenes here. And we see a healthy boost in the scores compared to the 5900X. Let's move on to photo editing and Photoshop. The 13700K now is about 6.7% faster than the 7900X. 12700K is 3.8% slower in the overall score, so quite close there. and the 5900X is about 20% slower there. In Lightroom Classic, the 13700K is 1.85% faster here, so not that much faster. The 12700K is 26% slower in overall score, which is quite a bit slower, and the 5900X is about 30% slower in the overall score. In photo editing, we can see quite a big boost of performance compared to the previous generation, but compared to the Intel 13th gen, we're still slagging down a little bit and not as fast. But regardless, it's going to do a very good job in photo editing applications if you ever use one. In Premiere Pro and video editing now, we can see that this 7900X really kind of slows down in terms of the performance compared to the Intel side of things. The 13700K is 26.6% faster in the extended overall score and 36% faster in the standard overall score, which is quite a bit. And as you can see, the extended and standard live playback scores are much better. And then in fact, the standard live playback score is 111% faster, which is more than double the performance, just because the Intel CPUs have the iGPU inside, which just gives them incredible H.264 and 5 codec playback, which this iGPU inside here, Ryzen CPUs, I wish it did a bit more. AMD could have packed a bit more or done some kind of a similar technology as the QuickSync, but they're really missing out here and leaving some performance on the table by not utilizing the iGPU inside the CPU. The 12700K here is 22% faster in the extended overall score and 27% faster in the standard overall score. Compared to the 5900X, we're not seeing that big of a performance boost, and the 5900X is only 7.7% slower and about 9.3% slower in the standard and extended overall scores. In Adobe After Effects, the 13700K is 7.4% faster in the overall score, and the 12700K is 4.6% slower in the overall score. The 5900X is 17% slower, and here we see a difference between the two generations. In DaVinci Resolve here, interestingly, the 7900X really shows its speed here and its performance, and is 7% slower, and the 13700K is 7% slower in the extended overall score and 2.4% slower in the standard overall score. The 12700K is 24% slower in the extended overall score and 22% slower in the standard overall score. The 5900X here is 26 and 24% slower in the extended and standard overall scores. So DaVinci Resolve really loves those Ryzen 7000 series processors, and the 12 performance cores here really shine compared to the Intel's side of things. So in video editing, if you're using After Effects or Premiere Pro, the Intel 13th gen and 12th gen look much better performance for your money, and overall performance as well. The 13700K is much better there. But if you're looking at DaVinci Resolve, then this 7900X is a better choice. But I do want to mention, if you're using a lot of H.264 and 5 codecs, you might find the benefit of the Intel CPUs, just because the Intel CPUs offer hardware acceleration for the likes of 10-bit 422 4K footage. So if you're using any of that, then you might still see a bigger benefit in DaVinci Resolve with the Intel CPUs compared to this Ryzen 7900X. But if you're using a lot of raw and mixed codecs, and not so much of H.264 and 5 codecs, then the 7900X is a better choice for you for DaVinci Resolve. In V-Ray, another 3D application here, we can see that the 7900X is really impressive. And in fact, I'm getting better scores with this CPU than the 7950X, which is just interesting. Slightly faster in the 7900X, but the 13700K is 28% slower, 12700K is 46.9% slower, that's a lot, and 5900X is 44% slower. Now the benchmark's conclusion is this, that overall this CPU is very good. Like, it performs right up there, and it's just slightly slower in most of the applications than the 13700K. Quite a bit faster than the 12700K, and performs extremely well at 3D applications. So if you're doing V-Ray or Blender or any other 3D application, then the 7900X is very impressive. And in DaVinci Resolve, the 7900X really shines a bit more than the Intels as well. The most impressive thing is how close this 7900X performs with the 7950X. I highly recommend you go check out the 7950X review and the scores there. But just a quick, little spoiler for you, the 7900X in a lot of the applications is very, very close or sometimes even better than the 7950X, just because some of the Adobe applications and some of the other applications can't utilize the 16 cores or performance cores, and they kind of become a bottleneck. But in photo editing applications, the slower 7700X or the 7600X are actually much better bang for buck, just because in Photoshop, for example, and Lightroom Classic, they're performing very, very close to this one, which is just interesting analysis. Now, the real world power consumption, and here I'm only going to show you 2 applications because I'm still gathering data, but the data that I already gathered was so interesting that I couldn't just wait to show you this. So basically, what this does here, and why I think a lot of the other reviewers in the YouTube world of reviewers kind of miss the opportunity how to test it. Because as much as we want to know how much the CPU will pull at maximum utilization power, that will only show us really what type of cooling we really need to go for and how hard is it to cool down. But in real world applications as a creator, if you're doing photo, video, or even 3D creation, you never really utilize the CPU at 100% utilization. And when you do like 3D rendering, you most likely leave it overnight or something like that anyway. Then the 5950X is probably the best bang for buck kind of CPU rendering performance, which is absolutely insane there. But when you're doing photo, video editing applications, you have a spike of kind of power consumption. You sometimes play something back, then you fiddle around with your crop and you cut the video, something like that. The CPU is almost never 100% utilized. And in overall, we're gonna have the average of power consumption. And what I have found is that this Ryzen 7900X, in fact all the Ryzen 7000 series CPUs, in fact all the Ryzen CPUs, often idle at much higher wattages than the Intel side of things. And here's where the hybrid architecture of Intel really shines. So let me show you the results and then we can see this. So in Photoshop power consumption, so basically I am running the Geekbench Photoshop benchmark while recording the power consumption maximum, minimum and average during that time. And we can see that the maximum power consumption or power draw, the 13700K is actually pulling slightly less, and here less is better because we want less power to be consumed, but they're very equal at 168 watts and 166 watts. But now the minimum power consumption is very impressive. Look at that. The 7900X is 53.9 watts and the 13700K consumes 11.64 at minimum power consumption. So that's when you just look aside and you're not doing anything with your PC. The Ryzen CPU is still consuming loads of power, probably because of the cache. I'm not sure, it's just the, kind of characteristics of the CPU. Whereas the 13700K can basically put all the performance cores to sleep and then use only a few of the efficiency cores to keep the system running, which equates to a lot less power consumed at 78% less in the minimum one. But now the average usage equals out roughly about 33% less power consumption from the 13700K compared to the 7900X, which is just impressive on the Intel side of things and not so good for the AMD side of things. Like, what I mean is that AMD needs to do something with the idle power consumption. And we can see the similar thing in Lightroom Classic. In here, the maximum power consumption is actually 14% more on the 13700K, but the minimum power consumption is 82% less on the 13700K, which equates to 39.6% less power consumption at average on the 13700K. So basically the power consumption thing here, don't be so drawn into the Ryzen 7000 series drawing less power than the Intel 13th gen, for example, because your power bill will actually be much cheaper on the Intel side of things on the 13700K or 12th gen, just because of the hybrid cores. So if that is important to you as a creator, then it's definitely worth considering. Now, this is not all of the data, and I'm still gathering the data, and I have to, do this test on a lot of the CPUs and record it. So it's not all of the picture, but I just want to share this, what I've gathered up to so far, because it's just very impressive. And what I thought about the Intel's 13th gen, that there's consuming so much more power, now to me seems like actually it's not that big of a deal if it just bursts in power, but actually my power bill is much less with Intel's side of things. So in the overall conclusion, the 7900X is a good performer, But when you really look at the price of the 13th gen and 12th gen, then there isn't much on the 7900X that it offers that Intel can't give you for less of the price, sometimes even better. Like the 13700K was very, very close there, or sometimes better there. So to me, the price point for this CPU is not impressive at all, and kind of makes me want to switch to the Intel side of things and recommend Intel much more, just because you get much more better bang for your buck performance on the Intel side of things, which didn't used to be the case. But now, interestingly, the tables have turned. But I do understand people who want to kind of gamble on the future upgradability of this Ryzen CPUs and want to see like huge upgrades in the future. But at the same time, I do want to say to these people is that you don't know what type of motherboard or what type of platform you need in 4 years' time. If you just purely need CPU power and maybe you don't need Thunderbolt or Ethernet or something like that, it kind of makes sense to kind of bank on the future upgradability. But at the same time, you might have features on the newer CPUs in 4 years' time that offer some kind of feature that this current platform motherboard doesn't support. So even though you might be able to pop the CPU into your current, X670E motherboard, for example, but you're actually capping some of the features, let's say PCIe Gen 6 or whatever comes around, or something that is in the future that's very much incorporated with your creative workflow. So I'd really recommend, if I was you, and I'd love to know what you think in the comment section below, but I would much rather look at the performance, what's on the table, and what's the best performance you can get right now on the table, and make the choice like that, because your business might be different as a creator in a few years' time. And also check out the latest pricing of these CPUs before you make a choice, whether 13th gen or Ryzen 7000 here with a 12 core 7900X or 13700K, because the pricing changes constantly, especially in the holiday season. You want to make sure that you do get the best price. And I've heard rumors that AMD is actually dropping the price on these to actually look appealing compared to the 13th gen. So thanks guys for watching. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.